The full book of Eva is available on Amazon, both in paperback and digital form. Links are down in the description if you'd like to check it out. Thank you very much for watching. Eva, Chapter 2. There was darkness everywhere, an unfathomable void of infinite blackness that enveloped everything. There wasn't anything to see, to hear, taste, touch, or smell. It was simply dark. It felt like a dream, and it went on forever. Only darkness in all directions with nothing to do. There was no telling what was happening, where it was, or how much time had passed. The only thing to do was to wait until something happened. Eva's eyes slowly drifted open. The light above was bright, the air was cold, and the room wafted with a sterile aroma that slowly filled her nostrils. As she took a few moments to take in her surroundings, she saw someone sitting not too far from her. It seemed to be a man who was staring, wide-eyed, down at her. Oh, this is brilliant! Yes, oh my, oh yes! The sound of his voice echoed loudly in her ears, so loudly in fact that she winced in pain. It felt like someone just dropped a microphone in her ear canal, and she let out a quiet groan in response. "You're awake!" the man continued, hovering over her bed with a flashlight. "Who?" She began to speak, but her body felt strange and heavy. "This is absolutely brilliant. Can you hear me, Eva?" The man was flashing a light in her eyes, pulling her eyelids down, opening her mouth, checking her entire head for some reason. "Yes." She shook her head to get the light away from her face. "Yes, I can hear you. Please stop poking me." "Try and sit up, Eva." The man's voice sounded excited and enthusiastic. "Eva?" She moved her arms up and pivoted her weight onto them, lifting herself up until she sat on the bed. "What?" "Wonderful!" The man cried out ecstatically, rushing over to a nearby counter to write something down. "Absolutely wonderful." He looked back at her with a vibrant smile. "Oh, Eva, it's so good to finally meet you." "What?" She took a moment to look over her body before looking back up at the strange man. "Who are you?" "Me?" The man came back over and held out his hand. "Dr. Alexander Baker." "Oh." She took the man's hand and gently shook it. "What happened?" "The last thing I remember." "Oh, brilliant, look at that." Alexander was staring at both her hands in amazement before he shook his head and his gaze returned to her once more. Right, yes. My apologies, I'm just awfully excited right now." He let go of her hand and brought a seat over beside her bed, settling down into it. "I'm afraid there is no easy way for me to say this, Eva, but..." "Why do you keep calling me that?" "Well, it's who you are, is it not? The only form of identification that the doctors could find on you after the accident was a tag on the inside of your jacket with Eva written on it." "Eva." The girl brought her knees up to her chest and hugged them, and as she did so, Alexander's eyes went wide with excitement. "Okay." Her cheek rested on her arms and she stared off into the distance, trying to recollect what happened. "Well," Alexander continued, "what's the last thing you remember, Eva?" She continued to think. There were lights, bright ones. They were coming towards me, then there was darkness. "I see." The man furrowed his brow and nodded. "You were in a very serious accident, Eva. Well... Oh, have I been in a coma?" She was starting to realize how little pain she was in. Nothing was aching, she couldn't see or feel any bruises. There were no marks on her body, no cuts or anything to indicate she'd ever been in an accident. "Well, not quite." Alexander sighed. "There is no easy way for me to tell you this, Eva, but..." "What is it?" She started looking concerned. "You died." The whole room fell silent as the girl froze in place, her eyes wide open as she stared down at the ground. "You," Alexander continued, "suffered multiple broken bones, a head injury, internal bleeding. By the time you were rushed into the hospital, there was nothing they could do." His voice lost all semblance of excitement or joy. He was somber and quiet. "So, I'm dead?" She tilted her head, trying to process the information. "Well, no, not at all. They couldn't do anything, so they called me." Alexander shifted in his seat. "Another doctor?" she asked, confused. "I'm the lead researcher of bioelectronic engineering at Altec." He seemed to be looking over her face for some kind of recognition, but after a moment, he continued. "I've dedicated my career to researching and building synthetic hosts for the human consciousness. He sighed and looked away. He looked somewhat confused, like he didn't know what to say. "I managed to save you by putting your consciousness into a..." He gave a more exasperated sigh. I can just show you, if that would be easier. She was listening along intently, thoughts racing through her mind about what he was saying, how it could make sense, and by the time he was done, she just simply nodded. Alexander reached over, gently took her arm, and pressed down on a spot in the crease of her elbow, and as she watched him do it, she saw a neat section of her forearm displace and fold in on itself. Inside, instead of blood, veins, muscle, and tissue, were a series of intricate wires and mechanisms to simulate a human skeletal structure. A small, confused squeak built up in the back of her throat, but she cut it off before it could fully escape. She shook her head. No. She could feel tears welling up in her eyes, which only brought about questions in her mind about how she could even cry, or if her emotions were even real to begin with. Hey, Alexander inched forward after closing her arm and rested his hand on her leg reassuringly. It's okay. I know this must be overwhelming, terrifying even, but you have a second chance now. He smiled at her, but her expression didn't change at all. I will, he rose to his feet, let you be alone for a while. She didn't say or do anything, and after a few moments she was alone in the sterile room. It was difficult to consider the reality of her situation. She spent far too long opening and closing the panel on her arm, hoping every time that she pressed down on the release that nothing would happen, that her body would go back to normal, that she would wake up from this dream. Tears fell down her cheeks once more as she curled her arms around her knees and hugged them to her chest. Quiet sobbing echoed throughout the room as thoughts ran in a loop through her mind. It was hard to determine how she felt. She was grateful that she wasn't dead, but she also wasn't sure if she was even alive. She sat on the bed in a rather melancholy state for at least an hour, venturing out only once she had decided that she'd had enough tears for the day. As her feet touched the cold floor, she jumped back up onto the bed with a small squeal. It was very cold, much colder than it looked. She outstretched a single toe down onto the floor, and the moment it made contact, she could feel every tiny nerve ending spring to life. It took a moment to adjust, but she then proceeded to place her whole foot down. Her skin sprung to life, and she felt every inch of the tiled floor with more intensity than she'd ever felt anything. It was the most bizarre sensation to be completely conscious of every tiny detail of her body. She could feel the exact points where the air flowed through the vents and onto her neck. She felt every piece of fabric of her gown touching her skin. She was hyper-aware of everything around her, and if only for a moment, she forgot about the turmoil that she found herself in and began touching everything she could get her hands on. It all felt so new, so fresh, so strange, and soon enough, she settled back down onto her bed and looked around the room. Perhaps it wasn't going to be so bad. Perhaps she could look on the bright side of things, give this new life business a chance. Let go of the past and all the horrible mistakes and live life anew. Alexander returned after some time, and as she curiously looked over towards him, she realized how tall he was. He was easily over 6 feet, his hair was straight, long, and blonde, and he carried himself with a certain sense of purpose. He didn't seem awfully worried about interrupting her, and as he adjusted his thin black glasses, he began to speak. So, how are we feeling? I've come to a decision, the girl nodded. Oh, what's that? Alexander sat back down on the seat beside her bed. I will try to appreciate the new lease on life. She nodded once more, this time more confidently. Ah, well, I'm very happy to hear that. He gave a somewhat relieved laugh. And I've also decided that I quite like this name, Eva. Well, Eva, Alexander smiled, do you have any questions for me? Yes! Eva nodded rather enthusiastically. What exactly am I? Starting with the complicated questions, eh? Alexander laughed. Well, you are you. You have all your own thoughts, feelings, wants, needs, everything that makes you you is all there. Your body, however, is synthetic. You mean it's not a real human body? The words left her in a rather disappointed tone. Right, Alexander paused. But you are still you, and that's what truly matters. Do I... Eva dropped her gaze to the bed, embarrassed at the thought of sounding stupid. Do I need to eat or sleep? Yes and no, Alexander laughed. You have a fully working digestive system, taste buds, the works. We strive to replicate the human body down to perfection, but neither of those things are a necessity. You can sleep if you choose to, you can eat if you choose to. I see. Eva was once again looking over her body, more interested in looking down at her stomach, which was covered by the thin hospital gown. This is all very strange. She nodded in a rather matter-of-fact manner. Yes, indeed. Alexander was writing something down on his clipboard as he responded. "For you and me both, Eva." "What?" Her eyes moved up to look at him once more. "Why?" "You see, you're the first." "First what?" "The first successful patient." Alexander shifted in his seat. "All other attempts have been either stopped by the patient's family or the procedures failed." There was a heavy air of silence in the room as Eva sat in quiet contemplation. Alexander waited to see if she would speak, but after her continued silence, he spoke up once more. "You're the first successful patient. The mapping went perfectly, the storage went completely uninterrupted for months. Your body turned out wonderfully. Everything seems to be working as intended. When I transferred your consciousness from the storage host and onto your body..." "Months?" Eva cut him off. "What?" "Oh, yes. Quite some time has passed since your accident." Alexander looked visibly guilty for forgetting such an important detail. "How long?" Her voice was unsettlingly calm. "How long has it been?" "It's been 6 months." 6 months? Eva's eyes grew wide in surprise. She clenched the blanket that was resting on her legs and shook her head. Yes, I understand that it's a shock, but we had to get your body to a working state before you were brought back. It was deemed unethical by the board to bring a human consciousness back in a form that it couldn't facilitate." She could hear him speaking, but she wasn't absorbing the words he was saying. She was too distracted by the time that had passed. "When can I leave?" She finally spoke up, and Alexander blinked a few times. "Well, we need to make sure that your body is sustainable, and we have to do some tests to make sure that your mental faculties are in place, but after that..." "When?" "A few days?" "Okay." She let out a small sigh. "I'd like to be alone now." The day progressed slowly as Eva sat, bored within the confines of a small hospital room. Alexander had asked her to stay put, and regardless of how upset, confused, or anxious she was feeling, she decided to comply. At some point he came back in with some books, but Eva wasn't in much of a reading mood. She pottered around the room and stared out the window, threw a stress ball in the air over and over again, but nothing seemed to really help alleviate her boredom or her sadness. She tried to sleep, but lying on the bed only made her wonder what the point of sleeping even was anymore. She wasn't tired, she wasn't hungry or thirsty, and the more she thought about her lack of human qualities, the more she fell deeper into a quiet, unrelenting void of sadness. In the end, the majority of her day was spent lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, obsessing over her identity. She had been optimistic about it, excited even, to be on the frontier of human evolution, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt as though her life had been reduced down to being nothing more than a lab rat. Alexander came back in to see how she was doing, but it took her a while to muster a response. Her eyes were still and unmoving, staring distantly at the wall as he spoke. She didn't pay much attention. It was hard to really be interested in talking to someone when you're not even sure if you're a person. "Hey," Alexander spoke up, cutting off his own sentence. "Have you been listening?" Eva rolled over in response, turning her back to him. "All right, that's enough." He rose from his seat, and the next thing she felt was a clump of clothes landing on her side. "Get changed." "What's the point?" She scoffed and pulled the blanket up to her neck. "The point is that we're going. Hurry up and get changed." Alexander didn't even wait for a response, and before she knew it, the door was closing behind him. She grumbled and sat up, sticking her tongue out at the door before reluctantly rising to her feet and changing into the set of clothes that he'd thrown on her. She replaced her hospital gown with a pair of jeans and a simple black top before pulling on a pair of familiar-looking sneakers. Although, instead of being tattered and torn, these ones looked completely new. In fact, all the clothes looked oddly familiar, but instead of her typical worn-down attire that had a growing number of holes in it, these were all brand new. For some inexplicable reason, the sight of her old, new clothes caused a few small tears to run down her cheeks. She started laughing as more started to flow, shaking her head at how absolutely ridiculous it was to cry over something as stupid and as simple as shoes. She pulled them on, tied them up, and hopped off the bed before making her way out of the room to find Alexander, who, as it turned out, was standing and waiting in the hall with his arms crossed. An annoyed expression covered his face as he straightened up. She could see he was about to speak, but before he could even say a word, her arms were locked around his body and she hugged him tighter than she'd ever hugged anyone. "Thank you," she spoke through some cry laughter. "For the clothes?" His tone rung with confusion as he awkwardly patted her on the back. "I mean, it's no problem, they weren't even expensive or anything." "No," she laughed and took a step back. "For being considerate." What do you mean? He sounded even more confused. We spent months bringing you back. Getting your old clothes for you is nothing compared to that. He shook his head and laughed, making his way down the corridor. Oh, she let out a small giggle before following him. Well, of course, thank you for that too, even though it's confusing. Yeah, I can imagine. He waved a keycard over the lock of the door before opening it. But you're here, right? That should be what matters. I suppose. She followed him through the door, looking down at the ground in thought before shaking her head and looking at him. So where are we going? Well, I'm going home. He stepped into an elevator, and once he was inside, he pressed the ground floor button. And I saw how horribly bored you were in there by yourself, so I figured I'd bust you out of there and take you with me. Oh, she continued to stare up at him. That is, of course, if you want to come, considering that we couldn't find any family or even an ID on you. I don't have a family, she said in a rather nonchalant tone. Ah, well, I'd like to think my home is better than some sterile hospital room. I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. She smiled, and as she stepped into the main lobby of the hospital, she was assaulted with a cacophony of sights, smells, and noises that flooded her senses. She pulled back into the elevator and lifted her hands up to cover her ears, a cry of pain and surprise wrenching itself from her body. The myriad of sensations felt like they were drilling a hole in her, well, whatever her version of a brain was. All she knew was that it hurt like hell. Alexander was quick to lean down and start inspecting her. What's wrong? He asked, but the only response he got was more pained noises from her. He spun around and started trying to get the elevator doors to close, rapidly pressing the same button over and over again, and once they were closed, he returned to her side. She was now on the ground, her body was shaking, and she was still clenching her hands over her ears. It hurts, she whined. It's too loud. Everything is too loud. It's too much. She started repeating the same few words over and over again. Oh, you poor thing. Alexander shook his head sympathetically as he reached around to the back of her neck. Her shaking made it slightly difficult for him, but he managed to find a small pressure point beneath her skin. As he applied pressure, her eyes became completely white and her body slowly stopped shaking. Adjust input sensitivity to 20, he commanded, and after speaking, pressed the same spot on her neck. Her eyes returned to a bright blue as she blinked up at him a few times and stared at him in confusion. What? She began to speak as the doors to the elevator opened once more. The lobby was quieter, less bright and less intrusive on her senses. What did you do? She pulled herself back up to her feet with his help. I'm sorry, Eva. He started making his way out of the elevator. We didn't think 50% would be that intense. No, what did you just do to me? She started following him slowly, reaching around to the back of her neck to feel the area he was pressing. He paused, and she could see a small amount of confusion on his face, like he was trying to think. It's a way for me to communicate with your body. My hardware? She tilted her head. It's okay, I know I'm not human. No, Alexander sighed. You're perfectly human, Eva. We just need to sort the kinks out. Can I do it? She was being watched by the people in the lobby. Apparently crying out in pain in an elevator is a good way to draw attention, so as they walked through the large open area, she found herself pulling closer and closer to Alexander's side. Well, yes, I mean, you don't have to do it like that, you can just... Once again, he paused in the same manner as before. Think it. We'll work on it, don't worry. You'll be the master of your own body in no time. He smiled down at her. Are you trying to say that you're my master? Her eyes narrowed slightly up at him. No, He sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I didn't mean... Eva giggled at his response, causing him to huff. I should have just left you in your room. Probably, she smiled up at him cheekily, but it's too late now. Eva stayed close to Alexander as they stepped outside. The warmth of the afternoon sun washed over her body as she stared up at the clear blue sky. The last time she was outside, it was miserable. Winter had made its presence known with the cold air that swept through your bones and the grey clouds that loomed above. It was strange for it to suddenly be in the middle of summer, to see people walking around in light breezy clothes rather than their stocky jackets and long scarves that hid the lower half of their face. She paused in her steps, taking a moment to feel the glow of the sun and the warm breeze that rushed through her hair. Come on, Eva. Alexander spoke up after realizing she'd fallen behind. Sorry. She hopped over to him rather jubilantly. It's just nice to see the weather so clear. Oh, right. Alexander laughed and continued walking. Well, you'll have plenty of chances to see the sun. Let's not stand in the middle of the walkway, though, yeah? Right. She shook her head. Sorry, I was just caught up. It's okay, I'm just glad you're feeling better. It's not too bright, is it? No, she shook her head. It's actually rather nice. They were on the road not long after leaving the hospital, and Eva spent the majority of the ride peering out the window in quiet observation of the outside world. She felt as though she could see farther than she ever could before. She noticed the tiniest details in the most distant flowers. She could read the logos of handbags of passerbys, and she could see the insects that flew around from tree to tree, bush to bush. It was strange. She'd always been an observant person, but never before could she so quickly obtain information about every person she saw. The color of their clothes, whether their shoes were tied or untied. She could even sometimes read the time on someone's watch. The entire 20-minute ride was mostly silent. Alexander refrained from putting any music on, and every time they came to a stoplight, his eyes seemed to fixate on her, like he was studying her movements. Occasionally, when she noticed something interesting or fascinating like a rainbow-colored vape or someone's tattoo sleeve, she would make a quiet, ooh. By the time they pulled into Alexander's driveway, Eva was back to sitting quietly in her seat, staring out past the front of the car. Alexander? She asked, her voice ringing with a certain sense of curiosity. Yes, Eva. He responded as he removed his seatbelt. I'm not sure how to ask this. She looked down at her lap, her fingers interlaced as she twiddled her thumbs. But she paused before shaking her head and smiling. Never mind. Okay then. Alexander got out of the car and Eva followed suit, her eyes scanning over the rather large house in front of her. It was 2 stories tall, built on a large piece of land in what seemed to be a rather nice neighborhood. The house itself was a soft cream color, and the front garden was full of lush, neatly kept bushes with a few small groups of flowers. Alexander moved over to unlock the large wooden door, and as they made their way inside, Eva took notice to the fact that the house was extremely well kept. There were paintings hung along the walls, small bits of decor that filled the house, and stylistic furniture that made the house feel lived in. Eva made her way into the hallway as Alexander put his keys away in a small bowl that rested on the table in the entrance of the house. She saw that he became preoccupied by a small stack of envelopes that sat on the same table, giving her ample time to give herself a tour. It was a lovely home. The living room housed an absolutely massive TV, as well as a long L-shaped couch that looked more comfortable than any bed Eva had ever slept in. There were throw pillows which sat neatly along the cushions, speakers which lined the corners of the rooms, and large blackout blinds that sat on the edges of the living room window. The kitchen was adjacent. The stainless steel countertops were completely clean, dishes neatly stacked away on a drying rack. There were utensils of all kinds which hung above the island that sat in the center of the room. It reminded her of the restaurant, and as she looked around the kitchen, she couldn't help but feel a certain sense of guilt wash over her. She took a deep breath, sighed, and continued towards the hallway and into what she could only presume to be Alexander's study. Books lined the walls. Most of them seemed academic. They were thick and had boring titles like Engineering, How to Make It Work. But she couldn't help but notice a small section dedicated to non-fiction, with titles like The Elves of Ardale and The Listening Forest. She knew that they had to be some kind of fantasy, so she smiled and took a mental note to ensure that she would read them all at a later date. Besides the myriad of books in the room, Eva also noticed the framed awards that hung on the walls above the elegant wooden desk that was nestled in the corner of the room. They all seemed to be addressed to Alexander, but before she could get a better look, she heard his voice ringing out from behind her. "Snooping around, are we?" He laughed and she shook her head. "No, well, yes, but I was just having a look." "It's okay." He smiled. "Come on, your room's upstairs." He made his way up the nearby staircase, disappearing beyond her view. She took one last glance at the room before following him up. There were 3 bathrooms. He began to speak once she began her ascent. She opened her mouth to speak, but before any words came out, she was cut off. "Before you ask, yes, you still need to shower. Your body might be expensive, but it's not self-cleaning." He laughed, walking over to one of the doors. "That package was a bit too expensive." "What?" Eva asked in genuine confusion before she saw his smile fade slightly. "Never mind, it was a joke." "Oh," she blinked, wondering if her body was actually bought, or if he made it, or what the actual reality of the situation was. "Anyway," he continued, "this will be your room. I didn't expect to break you out of jail, so it's not very homely." He opened the door to the room, and she stepped inside. Her look of confusion shifted into bewilderment as she gazed around the massive room. There was a queen-sized bed, a lovely wooden desk, a walk-in closet, and an open door that led to an adjacent bathroom. Her mouth dropped at the sight, and she looked back at him. "This is for me?" she asked meekly. Of course it is, he smiled. I know it's not much, but you can decorate it however you want. No, no. She shook her head and smiled. It's more than enough. It's too much, in fact. She suddenly felt even more guilty as she stepped out of the room and into the hallway. I can't accept this. I'll just go. Go where? He squinted suspiciously at her. She froze up, unsure of what to say. I'll just take care of myself, she nodded half-heartedly. Oh, please, he laughed. You're staying here, don't be silly. No, seriously, She trailed off in thought before speaking again. I don't deserve this. What are you talking about? He laughed. Of course you do. No! She shook her head. She could feel tears rising up, but she refused to cry again. She'd spent too long crying lately. No, you've already done so much. I can't possibly... All right, then. Alexander crossed his arms and looked down at her. I'll make you a deal. What? She looked back up at him. Her chest had started rising and falling rather quickly, but as she saw the stern look in his eyes, it calmed her in some strange way. I said I'll make you a deal. I'll let you stay here, free of charge, and in exchange, you behave and cooperate with the tests I need to conduct with you, okay? He uncrossed his arms and outstretched his hand towards her for a handshake. She thought on it for a moment. She knew he was just being nice, that he was only offering this deal as a means to alleviate some of her guilt. But the thought was so kind and considerate that she couldn't help but feel obligated to accept. Okay, she took his hand and shook it. Deal. Good, he smiled, shaking her hand in return before letting go. You get yourself settled in. Feel free to use anything in the house. He made his way back down the stairs, and she simply nodded in response before making her way back into the large bedroom. She took another look around the room before smiling and sitting down on the bed, and, without even meaning to, she already started envisioning fairy lights hanging from the walls.